in this episode of the Critical Oxygen podcast.
They're all peripherally related to critical power, right? And that's the beauty of this measurement, especially incorporating W prime. It's a complete description of performance, something that no other threshold measurement provides someone.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Critical Oxygen podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your athletic potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson, and today we're joined by continuing guest host, Dr. Robbie Jacobs, where we're planning on discussing critical power and critical oxygenation. Dr. Robbie Jacobs, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me back on the show.
Yeah, we're excited. I think last week we spent a lot of time talking about your new paper, which was actually just published today.
As the preprint came out today.
Yeah, of the time that we're actually recording, and we'll do a deeper dive, I think, on that paper coming up. But it was all about modeling a sub 2-hour marathon and what the actual requirements would be to accomplish that. So I'm really excited to look at that. And the big bent that you guys seem to have, I read the abstract right before this, are the recommendations of 30 to 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour, are those adequate if you're trying to support extremely high intensity exercise, right? Like a sub 2-hour marathon. So I won't spoil it quite yet. I'll let other people, probably read it. And then we'll go over it in greater detail in a subsequent episode.
It's hefty. When you open it up, it's 65-page PDF currently.
Oh my God. You never half-ass anything. I think with that mitochondrial temperature paper too, that's a beast of a paper. I was like, oh my gosh. You're like, hey, I think this is like, my crowning jewel. And I was like, okay, send it over. So you sent it over to me and I opened it. I was just like, I can't read that right now. I was just like,
when I have my students, it's so weird, right? Because you're so immersed in your research that it just totally makes sense to you.
Mm-hmm.
But when I have my students, because I don't have my students read a lot of my work, although I'm starting to kind of increase it because, I don't know, it just feels dirty. It's like, here, I'm teaching you. Yeah. I'm telling you what to think, how to think, and everything, and now read my papers. It just feels like indoctrination to me. But some of these papers, they really express points that I want my students to pick up on, and so I'll have them read it. They're not happy when I assign that article.
And it's one of those things where maybe it's like, okay, we're gonna read the first third of it, and then discuss it or something like that, because it is daunting, right? When you're a student and you're like, oh my gosh, I have to read 120 pages worth of articles, and then on top of that I'm gonna have questions, so I'm gonna have to go look at the references and figure those out too. You're laughing because I think you get a small sense of pleasure out of the torture of making your students
not at all.
read that stuff.
I really wish. I think one thing that ChatGPT is really going to help me with is communication.
Mm-hmm.
I like writing too, but sometimes I think that I like to write in a way that may not be the easiest to pick up.
You write like the people who wrote like the Odyssey or Don Quixote, or
That's what Karsten Lundby always says.
Things.
He always calls my writing prose. He's like, keep that prose out of science.
Yeah.
But it's so fun. I don't know. I have to. When you write so often, it has to be fun.
Mm-hmm. And maybe you need to write a book.
Don Quixote.
Isn't that a big one? I've never actually read it, but it's like a long book, right?
Sure. I don't know. I've never read it either. It's just funny that's what came to you.
Yeah, that's what comes to mind when I think of long prose books, is Don Quixote and the Odyssey, the Homer and the Odyssey. All right, detraction aside. So today, we both Robbie and I read a really good review on critical power, and it was written by Andy Jones and Ani Vanatalo back in 2017. I'll link it in the show notes.
It's a good
But
one. It's
yeah.
open access, and so if you're interested in this topic, um, Andy Jones currently is one of the biggest names really pushing the critical power research, and it's an excellent article. Describes everything very well. I would highly recommend the listeners go to that article and read it.
Yeah, and I'll link it. I'll link it in the show notes, and like you said, it's open access, so anyone who wants to can actually download it and read it, which is really really cool. So I think what we can start with is just like a quick definition of what critical power actually is, and well, not a quick definition.
Good. I hope you take this one.
Yeah, I'll take this one. It's this is piggybacking off of our second threshold discussion, where it's like, okay, well, what is truly the delineation point between sustainable and unsustainable? And I think your definition was, I can't remember the acronym that you used, but it was like
do as much as possible for as long as possible.
Yeah. Do as much as possible for as long as possible. So that threshold is actually going to shift and going to change, right, depending on what your race is. However, what this idea of critical power is that there's a noticeable relationship between the ability for humans, and this actually extends across other mammalian species, is that for very short duration outputs, there's a fairly high power output, and as you extend that out, there is an asymptotic relationship, or an exponentially decaying relationship between the ability to maintain power output and how long you're going to be sustaining things. So it was first noticed, I think, by A.V. Hill, who apparently just notices everything, back in the 1920s, which just blows my mind. And what he did is he graphed the world records, I think, in across like sprint distances to long distance competitions. And what he found is this exponentially decaying function where eventually it actually plateaus out. And, so at this point, I don't think he was super mathematically inclined to be like, oh, well, maybe there's an asymptote here, and if we do some modeling, we can actually figure that out. So fast forward, 80 years, something like that, and people started to recognize that, this was, you could actually fit mathematically this exponential function to these models. And what they were finding was that there eventually became a point where that curve approached a power output that could seemingly be sustained for extended periods of time. And that asymptote of that curve was deemed critical power. And then, of course, we're trying to take mathematically what's happening and then compare it to physiologically what's happening. So the definition became the maximal oxidative rate that could be sustained over extended periods of time. And however, what critical power actually does is it just measures what your asymptote, what your maximal sustainable power could be. But based then off of what we know physiologically, it was extended to oxidate, your maximal rate of oxidative capacity that could be sustained for extended periods of time. One of the challenges then how do we actually determine critical power? Because there's a number of different ways to do it. We talked about the comparison between maximal lactate steady state and critical power, and what critical power requires you to do is have 3 to 5 separate time to exhaustion trials, or they don't have to be time to exhaustion. They could be trials that land within the 2 to 15 minute mark. 2 to 15 minutes seems to be kind of that sweet spot where if you're lower than 2 minutes, there's going to be a very large neuromuscular component to your power output and other things like that. If you're outside of the 15-minute mark, then you could be introducing maybe substrate-induced fatigue, which might shift the critical power down a little bit. But that also might be relevant, right? Because physiology, humans aren't perfect. So what you would do if you were doing this in a lab-based setting is you'd go in, 3 to 5 separate times, and you do a 2-minute trial, 5-minute trial, 10-minute trial, an 11-minute trial, and a 15-minute trial, for example. And then, you would have this curve fit to your results. And if you're truly giving, 100% for all of these different trials, then you should get within 3 to 5% a critical power, which is that asymptote of the curve. And then there's also another variable that can be determined from critical power, or the critical power curve, and it's called W prime. W prime is the work that you can do above critical power. So it gives you an idea of what your non-aerobic work capacity is. And I put that in air quotes because there's some evidence to suggest that W prime is also connected to your ability to uptake and utilize oxygen as well. So it's all interconnected. And I think this is something that, we, at least you and I, really appreciate, is the fact that all the systems within the body are interconnected. So if you manipulate one, you're probably going to manipulate the other. But regardless, W prime has been shown to be kind of that non-aerobic work capacity. So how much non-aerobic reserve do you have if you're working out at critical power and then want to go and exercise above critical power? How much time could you last after that? Another thing you can do is you can, if you can figure out the work done and how long it takes to do that in terms of time, you can make it a linear regression model where you can get, a y equals mx plus b. And if none of this math is making sense from me just speaking it into your ears, read the paper, because they'll lay it out a little bit better. But the slope of that line, that m, is going to be your critical power, and then the y-intercept is going to be your W prime. And, from there you can actually translate this model from cycling, which is a power-based sport, to running or rowing or other, things like that, where you can measure the distance covered and how long it takes you to cover that distance, and then you can use that to create your linear model. So does that kind of cover most of the definition?
Yeah, it's an advanced way of determining. What I always tell my students is, imagine you're on a track, and the assignment is you have to run as hard as you can indefinitely. You start out at a sprint. So you start out very, very fast, but immediately your power starts to drop. Mm-hmm. Continues to drop, continues to drop, continues to drop in this parabola until your speed, you kind of plateau. Now, if you keep running, you're going to continue to drop, but the drop is going to be a lot slower as time goes on. And so that's that asymptotic, that's approaching the asymptote. Mm-hmm. And that is where critical power or critical speed would be defined. And why is that? It's because our bioenergetic systems supply ATP in that relationship. We're able to supply a lot of ATP very quickly for a limited amount of time, mm-hmm. whereas we're able to produce less ATP over a longer period of time. And then there's that same relationship with our energetic systems. And so that's how human bioenergetics is really used to define the critical power concept.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that kind of links then critical power to the physiology, right?
Totally.
Where
absolutely,
if you're just looking at it, like this is purely mathematical, right? You have somebody, run on a treadmill until failure at 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 8 minutes, 10 minutes, and then you can actually get, based on how much distance they covered, you can try to understand what the speed is that they could potentially run indefinitely. And so it's a mathematical relationship, which then requires us as physiologists to try to explain that, with, like the explanation that you just gave. And I think too, I think that might be one of the challenges with critical power, is that we take these outputs over the course of our the best effort outputs, and then we say, this is what you should be able to maintain for extended periods of time. And when you and I were working together, we would do these sort of tests. We would do a 3-minute, we'll talk about the 3-minute all out test in just a sec, but we do that. We do a critical power test, and then we would have somebody try to ride at that power. And what we were noticing is, like, depending on how well trained somebody is, if they're less well trained, it's like 14 to 15 minutes. If they're more well trained, you might be able to eke out 20, 24. And, so then we were like, well, if critical power truly is the maximal sustainable pace, then something is happening here, right? That we're overestimating that. If people could really only maintain that for 24 minutes. And so that's just something to be aware of, that if you actually do determine your critical power, your true sustainable pace over time is probably going to be a bit lower than that, and it's going to be lower depending on how well trained you are.
Yep. And it's going to also, within an individual, it's going to vary based on hydration status, based on nutrition, glycogen stores. It's also going to be more dynamic, kind of like weight. I guess we don't think of body weight as very dynamic because, one, we don't measure it all that often, but body weight's constantly changing based on our lifestyle. Same thing with critical power. And that's what introduces another level of sophistication that makes critical power, critical speed a little bit more complicated to fully understand.
And I think, I think, all of like the quote unquote limitations or downfalls to critical power are there for every other threshold variable that we're trying to determine too.
Probably more so even.
Because, if like, and this is something that I think is very underappreciated, is because physiological testing is not available to, to the masses to repeat time and time and time again. It's really hard to actually start to understand what the measurement variability is and what the biological variability is. Because, and this is actually, I was talking to Dr. Billy Sperlich, who's a training intensity distribution and, amongst a lot of other things that he's interested in. He just published a paper, well, I guess in 2022, published a paper. They did a VO2 max test every week for 9 weeks, and then they looked at what the most variables were throughout that. And for the most part, like things like VO2 max, other things like that, it was probably like 2 to 5%, which is like, okay, that makes sense. But the thing that stood out to me was that lactate, the variability in lactate readings was like 10 to 20% across the different trials and stuff. And that's like, it's like, okay, well, that's a lot, but it highlights the fact that lactate is kind of the integration of your nutrition status, your hydration status, your recovery status, like your fatigue status, all of these different things. And it doesn't mean that lactate is, that you just throw lactate out and say, oh, I don't, this is useless because it's so variable. It's just requires a lot more understanding to say, okay, well, what's actually changing that variable or that lactate value based on the test that you're doing? Because they're doing the same test every single, week for 9 weeks, and lactate's fluctuating 10 to 20%, which is
what else did
crazy.
They look at? Like what other variables?
I gotta look through it, but they looked at
sounds interesting.
Yeah, they looked at heart rate, ventilatory variables. Oh man, I don't know the rest, but I mean, I've kind of been doing some personal experiments as well. Sure. with that step test using Moxie, heart rate, and power. And I don't have a coefficient of variation yet, but I could very easily do it. And what I've found is that from a variability point of view, it's, if you actually just look at the graphs, it doesn't seem like anything is highly variable. I mean, and when I mean that, it's like heart rate or SMO2, because those are the two, internal variables that I'm measuring. Power is exactly the same every single day. But when you combine those small changes in heart rate and small changes in SMO2, you actually get pretty robust changes in how your body is physiologically responding. So again, I don't view that as a limitation to the numbers. I actually view that as a feature, right? If we're able to detect those changes and we know that, say, measurement variability is pretty low, then we can ascribe those changes to biological differences. And the biggest changes that I find, where heart rate might be a little elevated, SMO2 is interesting because it can go both down or up depending on, how fatigued you are and the type of fatigue that you induce. But when those change, they're almost exclusively after I do really, really hard days, especially when I run and get the eccentric loading, because I do a lot of hill work. So those are the biggest things that move the needle for me in terms of changing my physiological response to exercise. So it's interesting.
So I just read a study this week. We went over it in senior seminar that detailed how skeletal muscle fibers, especially following heavy eccentric loading, split. And part of the recovery process is that split fiber reforming, like regenerating into one. I wonder if that has anything to do with it. That's super interesting and coincidental that you just said that on a week that I just read that paper, and because I never knew that. And so this was a paper that started to answer a lot of questions about we weren't sure whether or not fiber type could shift over time. Right?
I remember in my master's, you were like, because of the data at the time, you were like, nope, no shifting of fibers. Like that's most likely not happening.
Right.
Has your opinion maybe changed a little?
Solidified.
Ah, okay.
It's even more solidified that most likely post-mitotic adult mature skeletal muscle
does not shift myosin heavy chain expression.
Yeah, from 1 to 2. But it does seem like there's variation within the fast twitch fibers to shift. Yeah.
What about, but I also think, though, too, we have to remember that phenotypic changes can greatly change.
For sure. Oh, yeah. The muscle plasticity is real. You don't have to shift fiber types just to experience muscle plasticity. Absolutely. Right. And there's more and more evidence coming out to suggest that even typing with myosin ATPase isoform isn't the best way to fiber type.
Maybe too simplified, you think?
Right.
Yeah, yep. And that's that's what we find with mitochondrial. Like people are measuring citrate synthase and they're like, oh, well, that's a marker of volume, right? It's like, yeah, at the time, that's probably the best way. But when I was doing my PhD, we measured changes to complex 1, complex 2, complex 3, 4, and 5, citrate synthase changes, like all this sort of stuff. And every single one of them was changing differently.
Yep.
So it's like, well, what the hell do you actually use? And I remember a paper by Dr. Miller and Hamilton that was like, you can't use one marker. And
unless it's maybe crystate density, possibly.
Yes.
That may be the one marker you can.
I was thinking about this because another paper that recently was published that has Robbie Jacobs' name on it. Looking around, it's looks at crystate density, and we're gonna go really deep into the mitochondrial weeds coming up in a couple of weeks, so we'll probably follow up. But what your cristae are is they're essentially invaginations in or foldings of the inner mitochondrial membrane, and from there I think those could be considered the functional unit of the mitochondria. That's what it seems like, because I think the more folds you have, the more surface area you're going to have. The more surface area you have, the more you can probably pack in more mitochondrial complexes, other things like that. And then, of course, we get into complex, super complex formation and other things, which haven't been shown to make mitochondria more economic or efficient, but I think are a way of organizing things a little bit better in order to pack more, say mitochondrial functional units into one place. So it's like super complex formation, cristae density changes, and then you're just packing in more and more and more and more, because that's what spoiler alert, that's what that paper kind of came to the conclusion, is that people with more cristae or more dense cristae within their mitochondria, that was really the big determining factor of their mitochondrial oxygen utilization.
Yep, mitochondrial volume was good, cristae density was better.
Yeah, which is so wild. Really, really cool. Okay, so we dove in. We talked about variability. Oh, the last thing I wanted to mention. So with like the splitting sort of stuff. So what I see in those repeated step tests is that until over first threshold, which is also a little variable, there's not much change in my physiological response, meaning that performance index that I think you and I have talked about offline stays almost exactly the same. And then it's once I get above first threshold, that's where I start to see the bigger differences. And then I imagine if I push myself going above second threshold, it would be even more variable.
So this brings up a good question. Because if you read Asker Eukendraup's literature on fat max, mm-hmm. which exists right around, closer to that first threshold, he talks about fat max is highly variable, not just but intra individual differences are pretty high.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know enough to really even begin to attempt to refute that. But given what you just said, do you believe that? Because then fat max would have to be fairly more static. It's definitely a dynamic measure as well. But as you said, at those lower intensities up until moderate intensity exercise, your biological variables are pretty consistent,
mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm. But I'm not measuring that between myself and other individuals. So maybe it's fat max or first threshold within an individual isn't really changing too much, but it's variable across the board. And it would make sense, right? If somebody is eating more fat and less carbohydrates, of course they're going to have higher fat oxidation. There was some data that was shared with me the other day where the guy was looking at where fat max was occurring based off of VO2 max tests in high-level cyclists. The first time the cyclist came, his carbohydrate oxidation was like through the roof because he was under eating. He was super, super stressed out, so his cortisol levels and epinephrine and norepinephrine were super, super high. But then what they did is they actually had him eat more. They didn't have him focus on fats or anything. They just had him eat more, so he was like less stressed. And his fat oxidation like went from 0.4 to like 0.8 in the course of, like a couple of months of him just eating enough and, and then essentially being able to spare that carbohydrate for later and later and later. So I think it's really multifaceted, and I think this is another thing Dr. Spurlick and I talked a lot about, is he is not convinced that the response or the variability in the response to training can be explained by just looking at the training. He thinks you need to look at the entire day's worth of stress, because he's got some really, really compelling, cool data to show that individuals who are more responsive to training actually move more throughout the day. Whereas others might not move quite as bit or quite as much.
I believe it.
Yeah. So that was just him kind of off the cuff, like sharing that with me. So I hope that was okay with him. But it's not giving away, he's done some really, really cool data and data collection, and he thinks that, we have to look at the entire day's worth of data to get a better idea of what the environment is, because even if you exercise for 4 hours a day, which would be a lot of exercise, that's only a sixth of your day, right?
Oh, totally.
So there's a lot that goes on not behind the scenes, but outside of training that could be affecting things like fat max, like critical power, like other things like that. So, yeah, it's really interesting. And I think, so we were talking about like variability in these different measurements and other things like that. And I think you just have to remind yourself, what is a measurement actually trying to tell us? Critical power is telling you at face value what that mathematical asymptote is. That's what it is at face value. But then if we start to dig into the physiology of things a little bit more, it's been proposed that critical oxygen, or dang it, just gave it away, that critical power is giving us the highest rate of oxidation or oxidative phosphorylation that our muscles can maintain and supply ATP to our contractile fibers for, right? That's like
steady state metabolism.
Maximal metabolic steady state.
Yeah, maximal metabolic steady state, exactly.
Yeah. So and we can talk about the like variations in W prime and other things like that in a little bit, but I think let's transition to this idea of critical oxygen. And this is kind of where the name of the podcast came from. So I'm going to name this podcast episode the origin story of critical oxygen or something along those lines.
Totally, because if critical power represents maximal metabolic steady state, then that represents a critical metabolic rate.
Mm-hmm.
And human metabolism, the primary supplier of ATP is through aerobic metabolism.
Mm-hmm.
So a critical metabolic rate, it's very easy to transition into a critical oxygen.
Yeah, exactly. So this idea has been floated around for a while, and I can't remember if it was it was back in 2017 that I was, or 2017, 18, 19 that I was a master's student, and you and I had been kind of playing with this idea. Actually, is if we do a 3-minute all-out test, what does that actually look like in terms of these other intrinsic variables like VO2 max, SMO2, by wearing a NIRS device on your leg. I don't even think we talked really about lactate and stuff like that, just because we weren't measuring lactate at the time. But what we were finding is that with the 3-minute test, and this is so much pilot study stuff that I was doing, is I would just go into the lab and I would just do repeat 3-minute tests. And I would wear, the mask to do my maximal oxygen consumption. I would wear Moxies, because at the time I actually just had started to work with Moxie as their staff physiologist as well. So I was like, okay, well, let's just see what this device is actually, what it can do. And what I was finding is that, first of all, within 3 minutes, you could reach VO2 max. Like, so if you wanted to just do VO2 max testing, you could measure someone's VO2 max if they just did a 3-minute all-out test. It's miserable and requires like a really, really hard effort, but 3 minutes, that's pretty time efficient, I would say.
You've done Wingates, haven't you?
Yeah, I did. So I got asked to go to Moxie Summit the first year I was working for them, and that was like in Chicago or something. This. And they had me wear a VO2, like a VO2 master, and I was wearing a bunch of Moxies as well. And they were like, okay, you're going to do repeat Wingate tests, and we're just going to see. And, this is one of those things where I was like, okay, like hindsight's 20/20, but they're like, you're going to do 4 of them. The first one, I went as hard as I possibly could, like almost throwing up. Like, I've never had this happen to me before, but I got like I induced a migraine. It was so bad because, I produced probably so many metabolites that just my body could just not handle it. So they were like, okay, now like 2.5, 3.5 minute rest, because that's the typical Wingate protocol. So you got another one in you, Phil? I'm like, yeah, I think so. I was probably pretty pale at the time too, just because I was like dying. So I did another one. And of course, it was like, it went from like power output of like 1,200 to like 800 or something like that. They're like, oh boy, Phil's suffering here. So, and I'm doing this in front of a room of I think like 50 people who had signed up to do like the summit at the time. And I didn't want to look like I was giving up. But after the third one, I was like, guys, I got a splitting headache. I might be dying right now. This is the worst thing I've ever done. So. And we were wearing a Moxie, and now I'm giving Robbie a conniption too, so hopefully he doesn't die on the podcast. But the crazy thing is that I can't remember if we could elicit VO2 max within those 30 seconds. It would obviously get really, really high, but SMO2 would plummet, and that blows people's minds when they start to think about it, because you're always presented with these bioenergetic models that are like, oh, phosphocreatine, 0 to 10 seconds, and then 10 seconds, maybe 30 seconds, up to 2 minutes is your glycogen system, and then after that is your, oxidative phosphorylation system. Oxygen is being used at all times, no matter what it is, and you might see a 2 to 5 second delay if you're using like Moxie NIRS data, but that's just because the sampling rate has to catch up, and so the sampling actually results in a delay. So what you see with this 3-minute all out test when you're wearing, when you're doing the all out test, and when you're measuring power and then SMO2, is that with power, 3-minute all out, you go as hard as you can, and then it'll taper off as you deplete your W prime, and then you'll find it taper off for the last, if you're actually pushing yourself hard enough, for the last 2 minutes actually. You take that, probably last minute average power, that's your critical power. You can take the derivative, so the area under the curve of the entire thing, that's your W prime. And if you're wearing a Moxie, or I say Moxie just because that's the NIRS device that I use, and I still work for the company. But if you're wearing a NIRS device, what you would see is you see right at the beginning, SMO2 plummets. And depending on how hard you're going, it's probably going to reach, some low point, which could be anywhere between 5 and 25%, depending on who you are. It might be a little higher for some individuals. But then it actually gradually starts to come back up, because what happens is you actually shift, I think, fiber type recruitment, and you get to a point where you're recruiting really probably mostly type 1 fibers towards the end. So you have this dip, come back up, and then stabilize. And what you can do is you can take the derivative, or I guess the integral, the area under the curve, of that first drop, and then if there's any area under the curve for before it comes back to steady state, you integrate that too, and you get this oxygenation capacity, or O prime, and then the flat portion is your critical oxygen, or critical oxygenation. And I can't take credit for actually coming up with critical oxygen. This was coined by a colleague of mine who I've worked with for forever now, Andrew Feldman, and his, I think his PhD advisor, I think his name is Dan Ehrlicher. But there's a paper that they published that's called Critical Oxygenation: Can Muscle Oxygenation Inform Us About Critical Power? And they published that, I think, in 2021. So like all of these things had been talked about, and when I was trying to come up with my name for like this podcast, this social media, this business, I was like, my appreciation for endurance performance comes down to that mitochondrial capillary myoglobin axis that we've talked about, the axis of oxidation, where the most important thing, I believe, is our ability to continually supply oxygen to our mitochondria at a very, very high level. And I think that's kind of where, our endurance performance lies. So our critical oxygenation is probably one of, if not the most important variables for endurance performance. So that's actually where the name came from. And those are all, it's like, obviously that is super, super biased in terms of I'm a skeletal muscle physiologist. More in particular, I'm a skeletal muscle mitochondrial physiologist. So that's kind of where that name came from.
There's so much to unpack after all that. First of all, I've heard from several people that the 3-minute all-out test is actually better than the Wingate. That's why I brought the Wingate up first.
Better than the Wingate
it's
for
easier
what?
to tolerate. Like, I've heard more people complain about the discomfort of a Wingate than the 3-minute all-out test. Somehow, I don't know. That doesn't make sense to me. I also
in a properly done Wingate, what you're doing is like you cycle up super high, like 130 RPMs, and then they just smash the resistance on you. So it's like just riding into mud and trying to continue to ride. And for some reason, not for some reason, I mean, we kind of know mechanisms of fatigue and stuff like that, but you have this massive accumulation of hydrogens, inorganic phosphates that not only accelerate fatigue, but also your body just can't breathe fast enough to get rid of it. And the single best way, well, this is what I've been told, single best way of getting rid of acid or hydrogens is to throw up. So, right, because your stomach is super acidic. But I struggle with that because that's not indicative of, that's outside of your bloodstream. So it's not quite as indicative of total pH. But that's just something I heard, and I don't know. I thought it was interesting. Also, if you're creating tons and tons of hydrogens, CO2 production is going to go way up. Your brain is going to be like, oh my gosh, we're dying because you can't breathe fast enough. So then there's going to be all of these downstream, upregulation probably of counter-regulatory hormones like epinephrine, norepinephrine, all that sort of stuff, and that also, if you have enough of a spike, will make you expel from both ends because you got to get the hell out of there.
Well, and also
lots to unpack there too.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially given what your dog did this morning.
I know. Oh my gosh, we don't need to relive that.
But you were talking about how SMO2 bumps up at the end.
Mm-hmm.
And then you talked about how you focused on just the oxygen utilization, whereas there's probably a reciprocal change in the oxygen delivery, right?
Mm-hmm.
The body's probably trying to auto-regulate to provide as much oxygen to that working muscle as possible, while the muscle slowly is lowering its metabolic rate to that critical metabolic rate, parallel with critical oxygenation, right? That's all interesting. I like hearing. I don't get to do that. Is the worst part, I think, about my current job. Day in, day out, I don't get to play with data enough. I love spending time with data. And it's the easiest way for me to learn, the quickest way for me to learn. And so I love hearing about you talk about this stuff.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, so if we think about it, and this is like one of the papers that I recently published with Andrew Feldman and then Dr. Brett Kirby, who's one of our friends and colleagues, works over at Nike. You might know him. He was only the physiologist on the Breaking 2 project, but I digress. Really smart guy, but we looked at the slopes, so the rate of change of SMO2 at during a step test. And what we did is we related those to lactate values and essentially saw that there was a inverse mirrored relationship of as SMO2 slope goes down, so more and more negative, meaning you're demanding more and more oxygen compared to how much your body can actually, or your cardiovascular system can deliver, you get a reciprocal increase in lactate production into the blood. So everyone's looking at lactate, right? But we have kind of the canary in the coal mine, which is our ability to, utilize or get oxygen to the working muscle and then utilize it. So that's another thing that kind of, for me cements this idea of critical oxygen might be a little bit more of that domino effect, because the critical oxygen point is probably going to then dictate your critical lactate point or your maximal, maybe your maximal lactate steady state, other things like that, because they are so interconnected. And Brett followed up, I can't remember. I think Brett's papers, have been kind of in parallel with Andrew's papers being published. So Brett did a paper that he's done a bunch of them now, but I think one of the first ones he did was looking at the relationship between critical power and critical oxygenation. So he took this idea and he said, okay, well, if this is actually true, then we should have a negative slope if we're working harder than critical power, and we should have a flat or a positive slope if we're working lower than critical power. And sure enough, he found that. So it's like, okay, well, that cements the idea. But the big thing that we have to remind ourselves of, NIRS is only measuring a very small portion of the muscle. So it may not be 100% indicative of what's actually going on in full body physiology. So again, what are the limitations to the measurement? NIRS is actually a small device measuring a small proportion of your muscle. So you just have to keep that in mind. You don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, just like, as much as I want to throw lactate out with the blood sampling, you don't throw it out, because there's things you can learn from it. And then what you can start to do is you start to put it on different muscle groups, right? You can put it on a vastus lateralis, you can put it on a rectus femoris, especially for cycling. What's really interesting is that there seems to be different muscles limiting based on different positions of cycling. So what we see with cycling in kind of an upright position, so mountain biking, road biking, those sort of things, the rectus femoris actually seems to be more the most limiting exercise performance. Whereas if you ride in the arrow position a lot, where you have that really, really tight hip angle, it's more the vastus lateralis that actually is the limiting factor. So what you'll see is if you do an incremental step test, you'll see SMO2 in I'm going to use myself as an example. I mountain bike a lot. It's fairly upright. So with that prediction, we would say, okay, maybe the rectus femoris is actually what's limiting performance. So if we look at the vastus lateralis during a step test, we see power or SMO2 go down, 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 down. And, if you have like steps, then it'll even out, even out, even out. But eventually what happens is, for me, SMO2 actually reaches a plateau and will just stay there and just stay flat. So this is something that I noticed in some people that we tested, is like they would get, to that second inflection point and then just hold SMO2 there for, the next, 3 steps or something like that. But what's happening in the rectus femoris is interesting. So in the beginning, the rectus femoris probably isn't too engaged. So SMO2 goes way up. And then as you continue to increase the power output, it'll start to trickle down a little bit until you get to a point where it's like, okay, you're working hard now. And I'm not 100% sure if it's 100% correlated with that second inflection point flipping over, but you see a pretty massive decrease in SMO2. And I know I'm reaching fatigue when the SMO2 is the lowest point that it's at for both my vastus lateralis and then my rectus femoris. So if I get to a point where I'm like, okay, vastus lateralis is 15%. If rectus femoris is still at 40, I know I have gas in the tank. But as that gets closer and closer to 15, and I don't know if there's again, I don't know if there's another correlation with like 15% for me personally. But vastus lateralis or rectus femoris seems, as it gets closer and closer to 15, it's getting harder and harder because it's requiring me to recruit more and more muscle fibers from my rectus femoris in order to actually get the power output that I want. So yeah, just interesting observations and just something to take into account when you're trying to measure this sort of stuff.
Do you ever lose signal? Because when I would look at your measures from your thesis, master's thesis, as well as several other cyclists, sometimes oxygenation would drop so low that you would actually lose values.
That used to happen a little bit more commonly for me, just because I don't think I was placing it correctly. But now that I figured out so what I tell people is it's, there's a learning curve to where to place a NIRS device and what you're looking for. And this is so hard to actually objectively figure out, because it's like, oh, well, do you want the range to be 10 to 80%? It's like, I don't know, because some people, their dynamic range might be 60% maximum to 40% or 80% to 60%. Like it might be like that. But what you try to do is you try over time to dial in the placement that's going to give you the most dynamic range without those falling out of data. Because what can happen is what the data, or what the Moxie is actually trying to do, is solve an algorithm based on what it thinks your adipose tissue thickness is, your SMO2 is, and other things like that. So if it's in the middle of two solutions, it might be bouncing back and forth. And I don't think that's not really related to like data falling out. That could be related to the Moxie not being flush with the tissue. But if you find very, very bouncy data or noisy data, you got to move it. And it doesn't have to be that much. You're just looking for, like a very muscular portion, and then you just want to make sure it's just flush with the skin. But I can't, it's tough to say. I don't think, because I did have the dropouts happen when I was doing it on my calf, but I think that was more of a Garmin issue. Like I was collecting, the data on a Garmin watch, and then something was happening where the communication from my wrist to my calf wasn't occurring. But yeah, those are all like troubleshooting things that we always talk about, to people.
It's interesting to hear that, because Kirby's first paper, where he was talking about the relationship of the slope change in SMO2 in relation to critical power, didn't he also show that you can put it like on a non-active, like he would put it on the arm or something, and you could still see the similar changes in SMO2 reflected across the different intensities in relation to critical power, right?
Yeah, I think that is a phenomenon that is probably seen exclusively in high to elite level athletes. And the reason for that is because what I find, especially with people who aren't very well trained, is that they have a really tough time desaturating. So if you're an individual who, is like, okay, I'm going from sedentary to trying to train a little bit more, most likely your mitochondrial populations aren't robustly, formed quite yet. Maybe your crystate density isn't formed well. Maybe your mitochondrial volume density isn't good. Maybe your capillary density isn't good. And there was actually just a paper that was published this week.
That's what I was going to get up. I was going to pop it up.
Yeah. So this is what I love the Instagram for, is that there is a guy. His name is also Phil. I don't know if he goes by Phil or Philip, but it's Philip. So we're going to be recording a podcast tomorrow, and he sent me that paper. He was like, "Oh, it looks like in these sedentary individuals, the limitation goes from a muscular limitation when they're sedentary to a cardio or to a central limitation after 3 or 4 weeks of training, something like that."
Sounds like it fits my theory thus far. And that's Russ Richardson and Peter Wagner. I mean, Peter Wagner was the biggest proponent for diffusive limitations of VO2 max. So having his name on research that's coming out that's showing or even suggesting that maybe oxygen delivery is limiting.
Well, and that's what's so funny about this is that that's what we see when we do the limiter assessment for people with Moxie. And this limiter assessment has been around for 10 or 15 years. So this is where it's like research takes time to catch up to it. But it is super nice to actually have that be validated now, because almost exclusively that's what we see. Is we see when we get somebody in who's sedentary, they, whether it's a recruitment issue or a mitochondrial issue is still yet to be determined. But in the beginning, they're just not able to actually desaturate, within their tissue. And SMO2 just stays high. So it's like, if people aren't able to actually desaturate under 60%, we generally say that's probably a muscular utilization issue. And then we just prescribe high intensity interval training or sprint interval training, right? Because that's the single most potent way of increasing your mitochondrial function quickly.
You prescribe the metabolic sledgehammer.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. If you're trying to carve the statue of David, right, you take your sledgehammer first, get all the big chunks out of it, and then you can tweak it and tune it with your zone 2 training, right? That's the analogy I've been using lately with people. But yeah, I'm also we're not going all over the place, but it's just like bringing up all of these ideas that I've been
Well,
having lately.
they're all related. They're all peripherally related to critical power, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that's the beauty of this measurement, especially incorporating W prime. It's a complete description of performance, something that
Mm-hmm.
no other threshold measurement provides someone.
It is a complete measurement of performance within the maybe 30 to 60-minute range. And I guess you can extend it out, right? Because you can then start to think about W prime and W prime repletion, maybe oxygen prime, and those sort of things. But the challenge, again, like the challenge I think then becomes is like, well, what's the translatability of this right now? Because there are some programs out there that actually allow you to measure critical power and then, like measure your W prime, and we'll say, okay, you're probably coming to, depletion of your W prime here. But that's very few and far between, at least right now. And from a critical oxygen perspective, still, we don't have the ability to say, on any given day, what is your O prime? What is your we could pretty easily figure out your critical oxygenation or your maximal oxygen steady state or whatever you want to call it. But it's that kind of elusive like O prime, W prime, which it seems like that's a little bit more robust in terms of not changing as much on a day-to-day basis. But I for sure think that it does change, just based off like if you're fatigued one day or not.
Well, so
It's
that's
going
what
to
that
change.
article talks about. I think that the difficulty in fully implementing or applying the critical power model is W prime or
Mm-hmm.
D prime in running, because they talk at the end of the article how in longer duration exercise, W prime starts to change.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at day to day variation for shorter exercise, just like you said, W prime is very static.
Mm-hmm.
And so trying to imagine maybe what Andy Jones is thinking, he's the one that coined this term physiological resilience.
Right.
And so I can only imagine that he's looking at explaining or defining physiologic resilience as the characteristic to help us understand the loss of W prime over time.
Mm-hmm.
Is it this continual kind of increase in inorganic phosphate? Is it temperature? I wonder if
Mm-hmm.
temperature
It,
plays a role in
glycogen, because
totally
there was
glycogen
another paper
availability.
that just came out in Journal of Physiology that was looking at the relationship between glycogen availability and a disbalance of potassium.
Cool.
Yeah, so I'll send you all these papers,
Okay.
but that one seems really cool where they did this in like in muscle fibers that were taken out of like a sample, and then they incubated some in no glucose, some in some, and then they did like the simulated contractions. But what they were finding was that there was a relationship between the rate of glycogen depletion and the ability to maintain your potassium gradient. And I was like, so if you think about it, this is where I immediately went, is because glycolysis is occurring in the kind of interstitial space, right, or the interstitial fluid, and you're going to have to maintain those gradients based off of ATP that's generated from that area. Then it makes sense that those would be connected, because the ATP from glycolysis could be going directly to the maintenance of the sodium potassium pumps, right? And those require ATP in order to actually maintain those gradients. So you get less
For sure.
excitable. You get less excitable with less glycogen.
And if you look at the heterogeneity of glycogen stores within the muscle, the glycogen stores that are closest to sodium potassium pumps, I think, are the most maintained. You see the storage around the sarcoplasmic reticulum and intramyofibrillar stores are preferentially depleted first.
Okay. So maybe it's like kind of like the last ditch effort, right?
Right.
Is to maintain that, because you have to maintain excitability in order for that muscle to continue to contract. So maybe it is the last.
And I really believe that the burning sensation associated with fatigue is potassissium.
I remember you telling me that.
It's not hydrogen. I really think
no, it's
that
the lactic
potassium.
acid.
Yeah, I know. Oh boy.
I know, you're like, if I didn't teach you one thing when you were in your master's degree.
Oh, I just gave an exam in XPhys and I have a question about lactic acid, and there's 70% of my class that didn't answer the way that I was pretty sure I trained them to think.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, I'll celebrate them for being independent thinkers, but they got it wrong.
Yeah. No, I know. But that's the thing, is like, it's so hard to break that mindset, right? Of, oh, well, I've always been taught that lactic acid, lactate buildup within the blood is what's causing fatigue. Therefore, I think that's like when you panic, that's your default, sort of thinking,
totally.
right? Yeah. It's, and that's like, we've had a lot of, it's like been an uphill battle being like, oh, well, rate of SMO2 change. So that change over time, that slope is highly, highly correlated with lactate production into the blood. And so many people have pushed back, being like, there's no way that this is connected, or not there's no way, but like, you need a preponderance of evidence to collect or to connect this, just because, it's like whenever you have a new measurement that's coming up, you have to provide beyond a shadow of a doubt that what you're measuring is what you're truly measuring. And, that the theory behind it is enough to shift the thinking of maybe 40, 50, 60 years worth of data, which is, it can be tough. And I've had questions, like I first shared this data 2 Moxie summits ago, and I remember distinctly somebody, saying something that's just like, well, this isn't convincing enough for me to stop using lactate, essentially like something along those lines. I'm like, that's fair, but it's also convincing enough for me not to use lactate.
Right.
So that's like, not to say, so again, I'm gonna play a little bit more of like the middle of the road here. That is not to say that there can be some value derived from lactate measures. I just think that we put almost too much emphasis on the use of lactate, especially within like the cycling world, because that's just what people have grown up with, are used to, other things like that. But I want to implore people, like, be open-minded about new technology that's coming out, because you don't need to be the first adopter of this sort of stuff. Have healthy skepticism. And, I was too, when I first started, and I know you were, with like using the Moxie. You're like, there is no way this $800 device is going to be as good as, like another continuous wave NIRS. That's $30,000 or $40,000. But I think that you've slowly been convinced over time, based on all the different, publications that have come out. I mean, all of, if not most of, the papers that Brett has published are with Moxie. And I know for a fact they have a lot of Moxie monitors over at Nike.
Yep. He helped model the Breaking 2 project.
Yeah.
With Moxies. I mean, he gave a keynote presentation about it at ACSM. I think it was the summer right before you came to do your master's.
Okay.
I think it was 2017 in Denver.
Yeah. Yeah, so, but like always, have a healthy skepticism, and whenever you're adopting new technology, I think it's a good chance to be able to experiment with stuff, play around with stuff. Like, worst case scenario, you return it to, the company, and you say, okay, well, that wasn't for me. I'm just going to stick with, what I know. But yeah, so I hope everybody got a good kick out of, kind of like this discussion of critical power and kind of the origin story of critical oxygen and critical oxygenation. I truly think that the use of NIRS could be kind of that next step in endurance performance measurements in metrics, because what I've seen is so many different ways of actually being able to use it that power just simply can't do, right? Oxygenation changes on a daily basis, like we've been talking about. So it gives you the ability to monitor local fatigue. If you're measuring with a heart rate monitor too, you have whole systemic fatigue. And then you can start to get an idea of how that's actually translating to your mechanical power as well. So I'm gonna leave you guys with that. Robbie, do you want to leave them with anything else?
I agree. I totally agree. I think as we become more knowledgeable in the physiology behind these measures, I 100% believe that NIRS incorporation into training is the future for sure.
Awesome. Well, with that, we'll leave you guys there, hopefully pondering and having some good questions. Comment down below if you're on YouTube. Reach out to me on Critical or at Critical02 on Instagram. You can find Dr. Jacobs on Zwift or Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it. Ask him questions if you have questions for him. And until the next one, we'll catch you guys later.